This is the first weekend of the NFL season. That means Nike's controversial TV ad featuring former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick is on the air. Kaepernick started the movement of kneeling during the national anthem to protest racial injustice, which some people don't agree with, and now they're taking it out on Nike. One store in Colorado Springs is getting rid of all of its Nike merchandise.
The anthem, the flag, and this country means a lot to me, and I continue to state that I agree with Colin Kaepernick's cause, but I just do not agree with his method of delivery.
The owner of Primetime Sports in Chapel Hills Mall admits Nike products bring in about half of his sales and his business could go under. Now, protests have also been long and loud in Washington, where confirmation hearings have been underway for Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's nominee to replace Justice Kennedy on the U.S. Supreme Court. Inside that hearing room, emotions are running high. Republicans and Democrats are sparring over documents being withheld from the public, and the New York Times publishing an email that purports to show Kavanaugh in 2003 discussing how Roe v. Wade could be overturned. And when Judge Kavanaugh was on the stand, he didn't answer legal questions involving investigations of President Trump, saying he wouldn't answer hypothetical questions regarding presidential powers. On the topic of abortion and Roe v. Wade, Kavanaugh says he understands there was a time when thousands of women died because abortion was illegal.
I don't live in a bubble. I understand. I live in the real world. I understand the importance of the issue.
Now, during Friday's hearing, Kavanaugh's character was put to the test as witnesses for and against the judge's nomination took the stand.
I will always be proud, incredibly proud, of the time I spent as Judge Kavanaugh's law clerk, and I am prouder still today to support his confirmation to the Supreme Court. Thank you.
If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed, I'm afraid that my right to make decisions for myself will be taken away.
Mr. Kavanaugh's record on affirmative action is particularly disturbing and ripe for intense scrutiny. Almost 20 years ago, while in private practice, he wrote that in the future, the Supreme Court would agree that, in the eyes of government, we are just one race.
But Judge Kavanaugh's efforts as a mentor are not limited to his clerks. He also works to maintain connections with countless law students and young lawyers across the country.
Well, Karen Breslin teaches about the U.S. judicial system in the political science department of the University of Colorado, Denver, and joins us now to talk more about this. It's been fascinating to watch these hearings. So many protests, so much conversation about leaked emails and other information. Things have gotten strange in Washington, or have they?
Well, they're definitely strange, but I think they're strange for a reason. I mean, we are at a unique historical moment since Roe versus Wade. Since the decision was handed down in 1973, it's been the subject of great controversy, as we all know. This is the first time that it has been as much in jeopardy as it is today if Kavanaugh becomes the next Supreme Court justice. It's at risk because the conservative objective for the last 40-something years has been to get Roe versus Wade overturned. And with Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court, that likelihood has increased quite substantially. People recognize that something serious at stake, and they're trying to be quite vocal about their concerns around that. Kavanaugh's inability to address whether he considers Roe versus Wade to be law that he would not overturn is consistent with how Supreme Court justices have handled hot-button questions in the past, so that's not particularly unusual, and perhaps it's appropriate. On the other hand, we're again at this historical moment where they now have sufficient votes to overturn whether a woman has a right to, or to reject the idea that a woman has the right to an abortion. And so very much is at stake with his nomination.
Sure, and his style of responding to questions, is he well prepared or is he evasive?
Well, I think the trick here is to not say anything that confirms where he would go on Roe versus Wade. And other Supreme Court nominees have attempted to be very opaque about that. I don't think that that means that he's not prepared. But I'm also not sure, if you read his dissent in the Garza case, he has a fairly shallow analysis around this. So the current standard is whether the law imposes an undue burden on a woman's right to an abortion. And if it's an undue burden, then the restriction should be set aside. Kavanaugh allowed or determined, in his mind at least, that forcing a young immigrant woman to wait for an abortion until she was placed with a family that would sponsor her did not constitute an undue burden. And he says around that, well, I'm simply applying the law to the facts of this circumstance. I'm not making up the law. But the concept of an undue burden is one that is, you know, full of leeway and play and subjectivity. And in that decision, it seems quite clear that he's choosing to not consider it as a potentially significant barrier to this woman's getting an abortion.
And no matter what, it seems that Democrats really have no options here. I mean, they're trying to put up obstacles after obstacle, but
I think the strategy, and as much as there is one, and I'm not sure that there is necessarily, is that if they can get people sufficiently alarmed about Kavanaugh that they put pressure on the swing votes of the Republicans, people like Lisa Murkowski and Collins, Senator Collins. Whether that's, I don't see any evidence right now that there's any kind of pressure building that would stop Kavanaugh from being approved. And
without the filibuster, I mean, that's another issue that has gone by the wayside here in these hearings.
Absolutely. So Kavanaugh is our second Supreme Court nominee to be considered without the filibuster rule in effect. The Democrats did away with that rule for lower court nominees, and the Republicans finished the job and got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees.
At the same time, he's a very good candidate. He's a very strong candidate. He has obviously a lot of support out there.
That's exactly right. I mean, he has tremendous credentials to hold the office that he holds. What's really at stake, though, is whether the Supreme Court will continue to find within the Constitution a category of rights largely associated with privacy issues like sexual intimacy, how to raise a family, whether you have a family. Will the Supreme Court continue to recognize those as protected rights under the Constitution? And the goal of the last 40 years around Roe versus Wade has been to limit or constrain the scope of those rights, if not eliminate them altogether.
So as we continue with these hearings, what else should we be watching for as we look forward?
You know, there's been some scuttlebutt here in the last few days about whether he's been dishonest before the committee. I don't know that there's a lot of solid evidence around any of that right now. There's been much made of this email where he apparently wrote in 2003 that he wasn't sure Roe versus Wade was settled law, or that he wasn't sure it should be characterized as such. And I think that's a lot of smoke and not very much fire. It's clear that Trump would not have put someone on the Supreme Court who was solidly behind Roe as a properly decided case. So if at some point earlier in his career Kavanaugh said something to the effect that I'm not sure it's a well-decided case, or that there should be some disagreement about it, or we don't want to admit that there's a lack of disagreement about it, that seems perfectly predictable and acceptable, and not the kind of thing that should result in him not being confirmed.
Well, we will certainly be watching and waiting to see what happens. Thank you so much for your insight here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be back in a moment.